From the heart of East Berlin, a group of middle-aged men ran the Cold War for the East. Their strategy included the standard tools of espionage, but they were also working on a new, secret weapon. From the early 1960s until the collapse of communism in 1989, this group spent years designing the perfect man. Their experiments helped create an army of undercover agents who were dispatched to the West. Their task: to seduce lonely West German secretaries and persuade them to hand over government secrets. They left behind them a trail of abandoned and betrayed women who had no idea their lovers were actually spies.
Those were actually the best years of my life. I was 32, you know. I could have lived, I could have had a life, and I didn't.
Known as Romeos, they were experts in the art of pretending to love.
What problems do men have in deceiving women? Not too many. You know, you do it once or twice or three times, and then you are pretty cold about the whole thing.
A lot of people will think it's just infatuation or sexual attraction. It was all of that, but it was much, much more. It was an eternal longing within me, which I never even knew I had until I actually saw him.
From 1977 until 1984, Gabriele Kleem had an affair with a man who she thought was the love of her life. She was unaware that in reality, he was an East German spy mining her for West German secrets. Gabriele passed on more secrets to the East than any other agent in her position.
He should have gotten an Oscar. The Oscar would be too small of an award for his portrayal, you know, because he was a fantastic actor. Really, seriously, because it never made me doubt this for a minute.
The Romeos were trained to exploit what different women dreamed of in a man. Margaret Herker met her Romeo lover in 1968. For 17 years, she too unknowingly became a key source for the East.
Hatte ja nicht den Auftrag,
I suppose his instructions were to humour me, to adapt to me, to listen, be attentive. And at the time it was important to have the feeling there was someone there for me. I'd never had that before. I'd never had anyone I could talk to about my problems.
The Romeo program, which entrapped Margaret and Gabriele, was devised in the early 1960s by the HVA, East Germany's foreign intelligence service, from their headquarters in East Berlin. It was intended to be a key part of their battle with the West. These were the years of the Cold War, when Germany was divided into Communist East and Capitalist West. At its heart was the Berlin Wall, which divided the city in two. East and West were sworn enemies, representing rival ideologies and rival military blocs. It was crucial for the HVA to know what their enemies in the West were thinking.
Es war natürlich immer das Hauptziel der DDR.
Our main goal was to infiltrate the key power centers of the West: NATO, the Secret Service, the West German government.
Bundeskanzleramt.
We thought about how to penetrate these targets, and we came up with the idea of going for single secretaries who had positions in important places.
It was the Romeos' job to seduce the Western secretaries and mine them for secrets. The East Germans looked for very specific qualities in the men who were to be sent to the West.
The typical Romeo was between 25 and 35, a good-looking, well-educated East German. He had good manners and would be attractive to lonely women.
Also in erster Linie musste die absolute politische Zuverlässigkeit.
First and foremost, they had to be politically reliable. What was the use of a good-looking man if he couldn't be trusted? We were looking for faith in the party, loyalty, willingness to join the struggle. So we valued political reliability above all else.
Strangely enough, these secretaries often fell in love with men who weren't always that good-looking. They had other qualities. For example, they might be a father figure, reliable and serious. More important to these women was the inner values of these men. Men who made them think, yes, I could share my life with him. He was the kind of man who, when he walks into a room, you think he's important. He's tall. He appears to be something special.
Gerhard Bayer was deemed to have these qualities and was selected to be sent to the West.
Ich hatte die Begabung, auf Menschen einzugehen.
My particular talent was that I really understood people. I could really engage with them and relate to their problems.
Sind natürlich da viele Fragmente.
This gave women the feeling that they were dealing with a very extraordinary man.
Hier habe ich mit einem außergewöhnlichen Menschen zu tun.
To learn their trade, the men selected as Romeos were sent to Belzig, a secret training camp outside Berlin. The syllabus was extensive: Marxist-Leninism, espionage, and most importantly, human nature.
Eine gute Agententätigkeit beruht immer auf den Grundsätzen der Psychologie. Also ich habe
Good espionage work always rests on a firm grasp of psychology.
Fachliteratur als Autodidakt.
I learned a lot about applied psychology and psychological manipulation. I studied human behavior very closely through various different approaches, such as Freudian theories.
Andere, ob nun Freud oder andere.
The Romeos were being sent to the West to be promiscuous, to seduce and deceive. But the East German regime was highly moralistic. There was no mention of sex. Intelligence chiefs liked to pretend women would be seduced by higher motives.
We were all ideologically very indoctrinated. The political motive for doing intelligence work was always depicted as the strongest, the most reliable. The use of human weaknesses was in generally played down. You didn't want to be seen as working with sleazy characters.
It was a contradiction the Romeos also had to deal with.
Die sollten also moralisch sein. Die Frau in der DDR war ja auch.
We were told that morality was all important. The wife was highly valued in East German society. You should never deceive your wife. But these guys were told that they had to go to the West and do the very opposite. This was a conflict that was always there and was never discussed.
Their training over, most Romeos were sent to Bonn, West Germany's capital. It was the home of government ministries and foreign embassies, the key targets for the East Germans.
Bonn is a relatively small town, full of ministries and administration. The professionals, so the politicians who worked there, they usually had their family lives, but they had lots of secretaries. And we knew that Bonn was a lonely place. These women didn't have anything to do in the evening. And for a woman, they had to find a partner. It's nearly impossible. They work long hours, they don't have a lot of spare time, and there are just not enough possible partners.
It was not only a difficult place to meet men, it was just no place at all to meet men. The competition was fierce. I mean, if there was one man, word of mouth, you know, before he even arrived, everybody said, oh, there's somebody coming who is not married, because most of them were married. And then there were just 20 or more women waiting for this person.
Gabrielle Kleem worked as a secretary at the American Embassy in Bonn in the mid-1970s. She had hoped to meet a diplomat to marry, but was finding life in the capital as a single woman difficult.
You didn't get invited anywhere, you didn't fit in anywhere. You had to have this kind of husband or fiancé who had to have this position.
Margaret Herker had also moved to Bonn in search of a new life in the late 1950s. She worked as a secretary to the president of West Germany.
I suppose I was looking for independence, to escape from the narrowness of my parents' home, to put some distance between us. I particularly wanted to get away from my mother, who had always kept us very close. So it was against her will that I went away, and I applied for the job in secret.
They were both just the sort of vulnerable women working in useful places the HVA was looking for.
A woman who had been neglected by life up to then. You know, she was in her early 30s, lonely, normally not too pretty. When they were too pretty, it was no good. A little bit ugly, not too ugly, because, you know, you had to enable the Romeo to do his job.
The Romeos were like vultures, circling the skies above Bonn. They found their victims so easily.
The Romeos now planted themselves in Bonn's cafes and waited for secretaries to seduce. Margaret Herker and Gabrielle Kleem were about to meet the men who would change the course of their lives. One summer afternoon, Gabrielle Kleem, a secretary at the American Embassy in Bonn, was waiting to meet a gentleman friend at a cafe on the banks of the River Rhine.
When I was sitting there waiting for this friend, I saw this man coming towards me, and he was so tall and blonde hair and fantastic blue eyes. I thought that a man like this would be actually the answer to all of my inner dreams, and I looked at him and he came closer and closer, and then he talked to me, and I thought, well, if ever in my life I could have a boyfriend like this. And then he asked me out, and he said that we could go for dinner, and he wanted to spend the evening with me. He ordered a lot of wine, and he talked to me, and I just remember the feeling I had of totally falling in love with him.
The man who approached Gabrielle in the cafe was a Romeo. His bosses in Berlin had intricately planned this first meeting. They'd been watching her for 2 years to see what type of Romeo would suit her best. The man she was supposed to be meeting that day was also an HVA agent she had met a year earlier. He had intentionally not turned up and sent Romeo agent Frank Dietzel to meet her instead.
They studied the psychology of the women exactly. This was very important. For example, she doesn't have a husband. What does she do in her spare time? That was researched in great detail. The Romeo would then consider how to make his first approach. He played out the situation in advance in his head, which story to use. It was all staged. It was pure theatre.
That day on the Rhine, the HVA had got it just right.
It was not only that he was so tremendously good looking, that he was so intelligent. Also, he reminded me of my father, which I never had. And this is something I had always waited for. And every kind of inner dream, which I wasn't even aware of that I had those dreams, he answered to those dreams and wishes and ideas.
Dann hat man eben die Schwächen, solche Schwächen registriert.
These weaknesses were all registered. Loneliness was a big one, like they wanted a father figure. So our man arrives on the scene. He has money, he's good-looking and charming. The secretary becomes obsessed, and she will do everything not to lose him.
First encounters between a Romeo and a potential source were not always planned in advance. Romeos were always on the lookout for secretaries to seduce. For Margaret Herker, it was a chance meeting outside a telephone box near her house.
Hatte mich beobachtet von seiner Wohnung aus.
He'd seen me from his flat. It overlooked the telephone box I used. I'd been waiting to call my parents, but hadn't been able to get through, so I'd been pacing up and down outside. He'd heard my steps and had come down. I'd never seen him in my life before. But after a while we got chatting and we ended up going for a walk along the Rhine. That's how it all started.
Ja, so ergab sich das.
The Romeo told Margaret his name was Franz Becker, and he claimed to be a student. She revealed she was a secretary to the West German president.
Als ich ihm gesagt habe, wo ich arbeite.
When I told him where I work, he was unable to conceal the fact that he was a bit nervous, a little bit excited. And I suppose he thought that's fantastic, and it fitted in very nicely, of course.
HVA chiefs in Berlin were immediately alerted that a very important contact had been made, nothing less than a secretary to the president of West Germany. It was now Franz Becker's job to turn that contact into a source.
Das war immer die gleiche Methode.
We always used the same method. Create trust, build the foundations for a long relationship, manipulate emotions. This was the simplest method, rooted in basic human nature.
Margaret and Becker began an intimate sexual relationship.
Ja, weil auch sagte, braucht mich.
He said he needed me because he was all alone in the world. I'm not sure whether it was pity I felt, but I did have this sense of being somehow responsible for him, a kind of maternal feeling. And when he visited me at my flat, it seemed to me as if he was coming home, that he was coming back to where he belonged.
Becker spent 3 years developing the relationship, with no mention of obtaining any secrets. He tapped into her loneliness and her need for companionship.
Ja, man konnte sich schon auf ihn verlassen.
Well, he was the sort of person you could rely on. That was important.
Oh, hat nicht viel.
He was a wonderful listener. He really engaged with me. He made me feel as if I was someone special.
For most of these women, it was probably a dream come true. They suddenly have a partner who's very attentive, who's very nice, who avoids all mistakes, who wants to keep the relationship stable and going. And here you have almost the ideal partner.
For Gabrielle, it was a whirlwind romance. Her Romeo lover, Frank Dietzel, claimed he worked abroad and could only see her every 4 to 6 weeks. They met for passionate weekends in hotels along the River Rhine.
I would always drive there with a tremendous amount of longing. You're just driving there, you were totally high, as if you had taken some drugs or something. And then you would meet him, and then you would know that this was the only life you would get for all this time, and you really had to make the most of it. The way he moved, and he just oozed sexuality. And so I was sexually totally dependent on him. I never ever considered even looking at another man. I thought that I just could not live without it, and this longing which he built up because of the lack of sexuality in the interim periods. And I always had to wait for 5 weeks, and he came up with those idiotic mathematical equations telling me that if he would go to bed with me 6 or 7 times during this one weekend, that this would equate, no, this is not funny, this would equate to whatever during the weekend, and this would then come up if you add this all up to this normal relationship.
Frank Dietzel sent the intimate details of his relationship with Gabrielle back to Berlin. They were pored over by intelligence chiefs at HVA headquarters, who could then plan the next stage in the relationship.
Sex played a role, of course. It was reported whether sex was important to the woman. This kind of information was included in a dossier, and the Romeo used it to plan his behavior. The Romeo would report about sex verbally to his controller, but that side of things was left pretty much to the Romeo to manage as he saw fit. But it was discussed when it was relevant to the operation.
Gabrielle may have fallen passionately in love, but for all Romeos, sex served a very specific purpose.
We had an expression for this. We called it the post-coital readiness to disclose information. What this meant was that women you were sleeping with were prepared to reveal an enormous amount after sex. This will never happen during the day when they're at their most rational, which is why you have to work on them in the evening, when they're at their most emotional.
Und das muss man natürlich dann auch nutzen. So ist es.
With military precision, the HVA chiefs in Berlin had made Margaret and Gabrielle fall in love with their Romeos. They were now considered ready to start delivering secrets to the East. Three years into his relationship with Margaret Herker, Romeo agent Franz Becker felt she was ready to pass on information from the president's palace.
Wir haben uns unterhalten und
we just chatted about this and that, about certain people from my office.
aber
He just seemed to have a very general interest in it all.
Diese operative Verstrickung
Her entanglement was engineered very carefully, very slowly. What she delivered in the early days or reported on didn't go beyond what any of us might tell a good friend or partner in casual conversation. But that was just the beginning.
Das war der Anfang.
After 2 years of receiving this verbal information, he felt ready to ask her for more. Secret documents from the palace. Margaret had now been with him for 5 years and trusted him when he told her who he worked for.
Natürlich nie von einem Geheimdienst gesprochen.
He never talked about secret services, of course. There was what he called the firm, which had its headquarters in Zurich. All I knew was that it was a right-wing organisation. When he asked me to give him documents, I didn't say, of course, I'll do it. I just said, I'll see what I can do if I happen to find anything. I agreed, so he had something to offer the firm.
Margaret began to smuggle top-secret government documents from the president's palace.
What I took were just little notes which I could slip very easily into my handbag, or a thin carbon copy which I could fold up and hide in one of its compartments. I had a good relationship with my bosses, but this was a breach of trust no one would have thought I was capable of. I ask myself how France managed to bring me to this point. Even now I ask myself this. He told me I was helping him. I don't know, I just can't explain it.
Ja, ich kann es nicht erklären.
West Germany was at the front line of the Cold War. Thousands of British and American troops were stationed there in NATO bases. All top-secret reports on negotiations within NATO were sent to the West German president. This was the information the East Germans wanted. Margaret Hoeker gave it to them.
In der seinerzeitigen Situation,
because of the situation at that time, the heightened tension between East and West, this information was extremely sensitive. It was rather like Big Brother looking over your shoulder at all negotiations between the alliance partners.
über die Schulter geschaut hätte.
Gabrielle Klim's job at the US Embassy in Bonn gave her access to American military secrets. Her Romeo also developed the relationship to the point where she would trust him when he asked her for secret documents.
He came up with a story. He said that he was working in Saudi Arabia and in African countries, and that his home office was in Munich, and that he worked for a company which was collecting information on different levels, also economic levels, and to some kind of like a so-called think tank or database, which would be used to support peace, to nurture peace in the world.
Gabrielle was obsessed with Dietzel and willing to believe anything.
This sexual attraction, which nobody ever had this. And this, I think this made me close my eyes to everything, and he just knew this.
Having smuggled the documents out of the embassy, she would photograph them at home and give him the films whenever she saw him.
I would have the films in the pocket of my coat, and he would hug me and put his hand in the pocket of my coat and take the films without ever saying anything. And then always looking at me like this father image and say, "Oh yes, you did very well, child."
Gabrielle's position at the US Embassy made her recruitment by the HVA a danger to the West. She was known to East German intelligence by her code name, Gerhard.
The source Gerhard was one of the most important the East Germans ever had in terms of the quantity of information and the extent of information that was being passed to East Berlin. She worked in the American embassy, so had access to very important information. She worked in the very office where arms supplies and military maneuvers were coordinated between the West Germans and the Americans.
Margaret was now regularly delivering secret documents to Becker, but their relationship changed. She was hooked on him, so he didn't need to spend as much time with her and insisted their affair be kept a secret.
I never really had an address. I never really had a telephone number where I could call him. Right up to the end, I didn't. He always had some excuse or other why this had to be the case. And this was an impossible situation.
Becker gave regular reports to his bosses back in the East on the state of the relationship. Teams of psychologists analyzed the reports and worked out how the relationship should progress. They wanted to keep their source happy at all costs.
The task really was to keep things on the boil, re-inject vigor into the relationship. And we did this with interesting conversation, love, an expensive holiday. Some of these women couldn't have afforded it on their own, but the HVA footed the bill, and it worked. It bought time. The relationship could last another year. If the relationship showed signs of cooling, it was always warmed up again to motivate the woman, and this was always done according to a set plan.
Becker took these photos of Margaret on their holidays together. But he refused to be photographed. Pictures of the back of his head are all that Margaret has of their time together. Even then, she claims she noticed something strange about him.
There was always something at the back of it all which I couldn't really put my finger on. He seemed divided, as if he had a job to do, and I kind of sensed this.
Margaret thought of leaving him, but Becker had been well trained in using a woman's weaknesses to keep her.
Whenever I tried to end the relationship, he'd come along and talk about all the good things, the good times. He'd always say that we needed one another, that we knew one another inside out, that we understood each other. And that's how he kept me.
I don't want to talk badly about women, but women, they accept quite a bit if they are really in need for some relationships. Women are forgiving in general if you don't overdo it. And you can play with the woman as long as you want. At the end, you open your shirt and shoot me. Oh, she will say, no, it's not that bad. It's true.
Long stretches apart, secrecy. For Gabrielle, too, life as the lover of a Romeo was never easy.
I never really lived unless it was through him. So this was a horrible problem in all those years, and it got increasingly worse. You would think, oh well, she didn't see him for 5 weeks, and she had a life in those interval periods, but I didn't. I didn't have any life. I didn't go out. I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything what I wanted.
Berlin couldn't risk Gabrielle becoming too unhappy. They couldn't afford to lose such a valuable source. She had to believe there was a future with her Romeo. Dietzel kept her by promising what she most wanted in the world.
We were in Düsseldorf and walking along, and he lifted me up in front of a window so we could both look into our reflections, and he said, oh, we were such a beautiful couple. And we will get married next spring. Of course, I was ecstatic. I was dancing with joy. I thought now I would finally have a life.
Six months later, Dietzel summoned Gabrielle to a cafe in Brühl.
Because I thought, well, we were going to get married. I was ecstatic with joy, and I thought that he would tell me, you know, something about the wedding plans.
But Romeos were not supposed to marry their source. They lived in West Germany under a false identity, and marriage would involve too many checks. So he made his excuses. The wedding was off.
I thought that maybe this relationship would now break up, you know, because he had hurt me really not only so much, but too much.
But the relationship did not break up. The trips to the Rhine and Gabrielle's spying continued year after year. Secret details of Western missile systems and NATO exercises were all passed on. It was the only way Gabrielle could keep Dietzel.
He always played this fantastic role. He thought, of course, if you don't bring any more of those documents, my love for you will certainly not die, but I don't know how I could keep on seeing you. Of course, if he would have said, if you don't give me any more documents, bloody well, I don't come to see you anymore, then even I would have walked. But he always said, yes, I will do the most I can, but I don't know how I can do it. And always calculating and everything, you know. And that's how he got me to do it. That's,
The men in Berlin had shaped two excellent sources. But their spying for the East was about to come to an end. The West German Secret Service, the BND, was now on the trail of both women. By 1985, Margaret Herker had been with her Romeo lover Franz Becker for 17 years. For 14 of those, she had been passing on secrets from the president's palace. But Becker had been identified as an agent by the West German Secret Service, the BND. While under surveillance, they noticed he saw a lot of Margaret.
And then, of course, the alarm bells started ringing. Who is this? Is it his mother? Is it his girlfriend? Is it his sister? And then we discovered that Miss Herker worked in the president's office. And then, of course, the alarm bells really began to ring.
Margaret's flat in Bonn was now put under surveillance. After several months, the West Germans had the evidence they needed. It was time to tell her boss, President von Weizsäcker.
He was very skeptical. Suddenly, the head of counterintelligence comes along and says, Mr. President, one of your closest aides is an agent. And, of course, you have to have some very strong evidence to back that up. And I remember that President von Weizsäcker was very dubious. My impression at the time was that he was more willing to believe Miss Herker than he was to believe me.
But the evidence was overwhelming. Margaret was picked up from her flat and charged with espionage. She insisted her lover had worked for a peace institute in Switzerland.
I really believed even then that it was an organization in Switzerland. But the police didn't believe anything I said.
In the whole world, there is no Swiss organization, whatever its political color, which would have been interested in the type of material that Miss Herker was handing over. And her claim that she didn't know what she was involved in, well, this is something all these people do to preserve their own self-esteem.
She was not naive. She might have been clinging to the idea of doing something good or working for peace. But the fact that she clung to something like this is a sign that deep down she knew exactly what she was involved in.
For the first time, Margaret discovered that the man she had loved for 17 years had secretly been spying for the East.
Habe ich erst später erfahren.
I only discovered later that he was already married when he was sent over here.
Ja, das fand ich natürlich ganz
That was a
schlimm.
terrible
Das war schlimm für
revelation
mich.
for me.
Ich meine,
I mean, the whole thing was bad enough, but the fact that he'd always gone on about how he was all alone in the world, without family.
Und,
He could have spared me that, I think.
das hätte nicht sein müssen, denke ich.
While Franz Becker escaped to the East, Margaret was sentenced to 8 years in prison for espionage, of which she served 4.
Ist natürlich schlimm für mich schon gewesen.
Well, of course, it was absolutely awful. I needed all the strength I had just to survive it. And if you ask me how I survived it, well, I really don't know.
Ein großer Stress für mich.
For Gabrielle Kleem, the end came in 1991. The Cold War and her affair with her Romeo lover Frank Dietzel were now over. The HVA had been disbanded. Documents uncovered from their files revealed that Gabrielle had been passing secrets to the East from 1977 until the collapse of communism in 1989. She had handed over 1,500 documents, more than any other source in her position. But at her trial, all she could think of was Dietzel.
They were constantly talking about espionage, and I didn't care shit about that. I always said, but did you know him? What was he like? And did he love me? I'm sorry, I always wanted to know, did he have some feelings for me? Or was it all just a lie? I really wanted to know. If something like that happens to you, you tend to question yourself what is true and what is not true, and what part is real and what part is imagined, and what part is a story and what part is a fiction. And you go absolutely insane because you just feel like you are disintegrating bit by bit by bit by bit. Memories were false. Everything you lived for was kind of taken away. So you have practically no identity. We were people, and they destroyed us in every level.
As the Cold War was now over, Gabrielle received a 2-year suspended sentence. The men who ran the operation from Berlin were not even put on trial, as they were deemed to have been doing their job.
I think it's so devastating that some stupid assholes, I'm sorry, whom I don't know from a hole in the ground, sit in some stupid shit office in East Germany, picking people, women out, you know, like animals for testing, and saying, okay, we are going to destroy her life.
Today, Margaret Herker lives alone in her parents' old house. After her release from prison, she had nowhere to go but the place she had left 30 years earlier in search of an exciting life in Bonn. She has not seen Franz Becker since her arrest. He is now seriously ill.
Ich denke, muss jetzt mit sich zurechtkommen.
It seems to me that he now has to live with himself, and that must be hard enough. But I think I've worked through a lot of this. This is his issue now. I don't have any feelings of hatred. The relationship was a huge part of my life. It did have a purpose and a meaning for me. So in that respect, these were not wasted years.
Gabrielle Kleem now lives alone in Holland with her 13 dogs. There is little sympathy for the plight of Gabrielle and Margaret from the men who benefited from the secrets they gave.
We never abused women. We saw it as a legitimate method, a method which was justified by the very real threat posed by the Cold War. If we're talking about the brutality of secret services, if you show me this broken heart, well, then I can show you much, much worse. Look back through history, and a few broken hearts look like nothing.
Whichever way you look at it, espionage is a dirty business, but it's necessary. There is always a point where you want to know more from someone than he's prepared to reveal, and to get at this information, you use all the means at your disposal. And because the human being is always the weakest link in the chain, you use this weakness to your own advantage. C'est la vie.
C'est la vie.
If it hadn't been the Romeo, for this poor woman, there would be 10 years of a happy life maybe missing. I don't think there was a too big human cost to it, because it goes into the general mixture of human fate and human happiness and unhappiness. Some of them are probably very happy with their Romeos.
Gabrielle's Romeo lover died several years ago. He may have deceived her to keep her spying, but to this day, she has not let go.
If he would walk into my life like I remember him, I'm terribly afraid that I would fall in love with him again. And because I'm now alone again, totally alone, a very big part of me would say yes, that I loved you and you filled a void in me which nobody ever could or would or will again. And why don't we just move on from there, oh God, and live for once together?